The history of the steam engine as the primary motive power of Britain's railways spanned a period of over 150 years. During that time, there were many different designs by many different designers, whose names became household words when railways were the pinnacle of man's industrial achievements. Few have not heard of Robert Stephenson and his rocket, or Sir Nigel Gresley and his Flying Scotsman. Steam engines reached virtually every part of the country as the system spread through the 19th century, built by a myriad of companies. In the early days, no two locomotives were the same, but development rapidly resulted in batches of identical machines, and then interchangeability between classes. It was desirable for the larger companies to be able to keep spares at more and more widespread locations, so some standardization of parts became necessary. This was taken to its logical conclusion on the Great Western Railway by Churchwood, and following the railway grouping of 1923, three of the great companies produced their own standard ranges of locomotives. The Southern was intent on electrification. Then, in 1948, the railways became one business, British Railways, and it was inevitable that a standard range of steam locomotives would be produced by that concern in the early 1950s. The first British Railway standard appeared in 1951. This was the Class 7 Pacific, known as the Britannia class, after the first built engine, number 70,000. They were to be allocated to all the regions, the successors to the old independent companies, and a total of 55 were built. With 6'2" driving wheels and only 2 cylinders, they were unlike anything produced before and were somewhat utilitarian in appearance. 10 Pacifics were built with smaller boilers as Class 6 and known as clams for use in Scotland. Rather more standard Class 5s were built, 172 of them. They were a logical development with standard fittings of the LMS Stanier Class 5s, and therein lies the foundation of the standard range. British Railways CME was Robin Riddles, an ex-LMS man, and his design team was recruited from ex-LMS staff. There were 3 types of Class 4s, 460s, 260s, and these 264 tanks. Class 3 260s and the 262 tanks were a Western speciality, a standard version of their large prairies, whilst the final standards were the Class 9F freight engines, a brand new design which traced its ancestry to the Stanier 8Fs via the wartime Dubdies or austerities. 251 of these spaceships were constructed, and the last one was the last BR steam engine to be built. Our regional roundup starts as usual with the Western, no longer great. A batch of Britannias was allocated to the Western in 1951, the first Pacifics on these metals since the solitary number 111, the Great Bear, and of course LMS, SR and LNER participants in the 1948 exchanges. The Western drivers didn't really take to them, as their own standardization, which had now lasted half a century, meant they were familiar with one type of cab layout and method of working. The new standards were totally alien in concept, and to boot, left-hand drive when all Western engines were right-hand drive. This meant that sighting of signals was difficult and led to an accident at Didcot in 1955, as a result of which the smoke deflector handrails were removed. Most of them had been transferred to the London Midland region by the end of the decade, leaving traditional Great Western types to rule the roost until the end of steam. Even the naming of some of the Britannias after the stars had failed to mollify Western traditionalists. It probably enraged them further. The last castles were built in 1950 and boasted the final Hawksworth design of flat-sided tenders. By this time, the first of the class had been withdrawn, albeit one of the star rebuilds, 100A1 Lloyds, originally 4009 Shooting Star. The first of the heavy freight 280s, the historic prototype number 2800, also went in the decade in 1958. They were replaced by the BR Standard Class 9s, which received a better welcome than the Britannias. Great Western, the last express locomotive the GWR built, illustrates one aspect of the Great Western that was to live on: Brunswick green livery. It was used initially on Class 6 and 7P passenger locomotives, and from about 1956 onwards, in a fit of Great Western regionalism, on most ex-GWR classes. These halls should have been mixed traffic lined black, as is this county, the final GWR design of passenger locomotive, although designated mixed traffic, and thus correctly painted. All these trains are seen south of Oxford in the early 50s. A correct hall follows, heading a train consisting of coaches in the plain red livery for suburban and local stock. A black prairie heads some more red coaches, this being the colour used with cream for mainline stock, more familiarly known as blood and custard. When freshly applied, it looked magnificent, and wasn't too different to the GWR's own chocolate and cream, seen on the last coach here. Another hall grinds by on a freight, showing why these versatile 460s were designated mixed traffic and painted black. One aspect of nationalisation was the increased use of foreign locomotives. The Southerns, Lord Nelsons, were used on inter-regional trains to Oxford from Basingstoke, a pre-nationalisation practice which was to grow. These trains also meant that Bulleid's new Pacifics were also to be seen deep in Western territory, witnessed by Combe Martin at Oxford Station. The advent of 140 Pacifics on the Southern had rendered the Nelsons virtually obsolete, so the Southern had to find jobs such as the interregionals for them. However, there were so many Bulleids that they also took these jobs. The cosmopolitan air of the new integrated railway is well seen at Oxford, as an LMS Fowler 4F passes through. But a still independent industrial shunter shows that not all locomotives belong to BR. Alongside a hall in the station is an ROD to represent an LNER constituent. But, of course, this is one of those bought from the government by the GWR, and never an LNER machine. Another Southern type drifts through, a Uri N15, integrated into the King Arthur class. All would be gone in this decade. Similarly, except for the Duke dogs, the last GWR double framers would go at the beginning of the decade. The 1950s would see a holocaust of pre-grouping designs, which the BR standards were intended to replace. The heady promises of massive electrification programs of the mid-1940s had gone by the wayside, and the new BR locomotive team had realized they would have to produce new steam engines to fill the gap, until those promises could be resurrected. Throughout the 1950s, the railways became a political football, changes in the colour of the government playing havoc with all aspects of the railways and being the main reason for their sharp decline in the decade. (1955) was the watershed. A modernisation plan was announced by a conservative government that was ideologically opposed to a publicly funded system, so it wasn't wholehearted. Its main premise was the elimination of steam and its replacement by diesels and electrics. The Western was allowed to make its own plans, as no electrification was scheduled for its lines. So, even in its dieselisation schemes, it retained a marked degree of independence. However, the financial situation deteriorated so quickly that a revised modernisation scheme was announced 2 years later, which proposed the elimination of steam within a decade. The last few steam engines to be built would be BR standards. To the Western's famous workshops at Swindon would go the final order. The 1950s were thus to be an era of great change on the railways. At first, however, there was little change to see. These scenes at Warwick and Leamington Spa can be compared with those seen in the earlier programmes in this series. The Kings still ruled on the Birmingham expresses, and even the name of the Great Western could still be seen for a while. But stagnation was the name of the game on the Western. For so long had it enjoyed its superiority based on its continuity that advances elsewhere had passed it by. The Kings were unchanged from their introduction in the 1920s, and the castles, which were still being built in this decade, despite various small improvements, were really only large boilered stars. The latter, one of which is seen entering Leamington, were to be phased out during the decade. The last, Princess Margaret, going in 1957. Most had been replaced by castles. The last ones were replaced by the Britannias, and the first of the diesels. The poor performance of the nationalised railways in the 1950s was to lead to a number of related phenomena. The first of these was the inevitable shrinking of the network. This led to the second and third, the reduction in the locomotive fleet and, almost its corollary, the growth of interest in the railways. These scenes combine all these as a group of enthusiasts, the Stephenson Locomotive Society, visited the threatened Shipston-on-Stour branch using one of the last of the Midland and South Western locomotives, 240 number 1335. This was one of 3 small tender engines built in 1894 for the cross-country line that ran, curiously, from Andover to Andoversfort. Absorbed by the GWR in 1923, its locomotives had been westernized, but were now obsolete. Number 1335 would be withdrawn shortly after this rail tour. Our first views of the train are at Moulton in Marsh Station, where it had to be shunted prior to the run up the branch. This manoeuvring was necessary as the train had started at Oxford and the Shipston line was on the opposite side of the main line. Known locally as the tramway, its history was typical of many small rural lines inherited by British Railways. Opened in 1889, it supported a passenger service for only 40 years, succumbing to bus competition in the 1920s. It wasn't closed, but retained a twice-a-week goods service into the 1950s. It was thus a magnet to enthusiasts who couldn't normally travel over it. A number of excursions were run during our decade, this one taking place on the 31st of August 1952. This was just before a number of branch and rural line closures were announced by British Railways, the first signs of straitened circumstances. Surprisingly, the Shipston line wasn't on the hit list, and it was to survive right through the 50s, but only just, being closed 5 months into the 60s. Finally, the third element. The Stephenson Locomotive Society had been formed in 1909, the earliest railway enthusiasts club. It was one of the pioneers in the organising of special trains, this being one of the earliest of all, as privately organised tours only really got underway that year, which was to see quite a spate of them. The SLS was soon to be joined by many other clubs, most notably the Ian Allen Locospotters Club, which had been founded in the late 1940s to generate a wider interest in railways amongst the young. This was accompanied by the establishment of a great publishing empire, which, with its famous ABC booklets listing all the locomotives of British Railways, its Trains Illustrated magazine, and the legion of authoritative books on all railway matters, ensured that the latter days of steam were fully recorded. A Britannia is seen outside the GWR's massive Swindon works, together with some native castles. The only major development on these engines in GWR days had been the gradual increase in superheating, evidenced by larger header covers on the smokebox sides. The class had been equipped with 2-row superheaters when first introduced, and these were increased to 3-row with the post-war construction. A 4-row was then tried, and it became standard in the 1950s. Under SOL, a program was instituted to improve steaming, the increased superheating being part of this program, which was primarily concentrated on the King class. It was a long process, carrying on through the first part of the decade, its ultimate expression being the fitment of double chimneys and blast pipes to all the Kings and 67 classes. Another SLS rail tour is seen at Swindon. The Duke dogs, as the last survivors of the double framers, were popular for rail tours. Another pair is seen on a special train over the Cambrian Main Line for members of one of the narrow gauge railway preservation groups. Preservation was another phenomenon of the 1950s and started in the Welsh mountains, where there were a number of narrow gauge lines, primarily built for the slate trade. Many of these railways remained independent, but a number had been absorbed by the Cambrian railways and consequently by the Great Western and therefore British railways. The latter set about closing them down, as the Welsh slate trade was in decline by this time. However, one line had always had tourism as its primary role and was retained. This was the Vale of Rheidol light railway, which wound its way up the mountainside from Aberystwyth to the well-known and ominously named Devil's Bridge. In the late 50s, the locomotives were the only narrow-gauge engines to receive BR's later form of heraldic crest, introduced in 1957 and produced in 2 forms, left and right hand. The right-hand one was not approved by the College of Heralds and banned. Thereafter, only the left-hand version was used. The Vale of Rheidol locomotives had been built by the Cambrian and the Great Western, and the line became British Railway's last narrow-gauge line, the engines surviving beyond the end of steam on the standard gauge by over 20 years. These views of the Devil's Bridge terminus show the line as it was before it was commercialized. The reintroduction of Great Western liveries for the locomotives and coaches coincided with their reintroduction on named trains on the main lines. The Vale of Rheidol was to be the first part of British Railways to be privatised at the end of the 1980s. The foundations of the railway preservation movement were laid in the Welsh mountains at the beginning of our decade. Running inland from the coastal village of Tywyn was the Talyllyn Railway, whose owner, Sir Haydn Jones, had died in July 1950. It looked like the railway would also expire. Tom Rote was the driving force of a group of enthusiasts who formed the Talyllyn Railway Preservation Society. They reached agreement with Sir Haydn's executors to take over operation of the line for 1951, using the one locomotive still working, Dolgoch. It had been Sir Haydn's wish to keep the railway open for the benefit of his constituents, as he was the local MP. It was his wife's intention to fulfill that wish, and the advent of the preservationists had allowed her to do so. Subsequently, the Society took it over completely and has run it ever since. These scenes show the volunteers at work preparing the railway during the spring of 1951 for the ceremonial opening at Whitsun. So the railway never closed and the preservation era had begun. A little further north was another narrow-gauge railway which had also fallen on hard times. This was the historic Festiniog Railway, with its famous double-ended Fairlie locomotives. Another preservation society was formed, but the task was rather greater, as the railway had closed down in 1946. Reopening took place in 1955, over the short distance to Boston Lodge, and by the end of the decade, a 6-mile line ran up into the mountains once again. Iron Duke passes through Basingstoke on the Bournemouth Bell in 1952. Just 3 Britannias were, temporarily, allocated to the Southern for use on prestige expresses. But the normal motive power were the bullied Pacifics. The principal locomotive story on the region in the 1950s was the rebuilding of the bullies, which resulted in one of the most handsome conventional locomotive outlines, very much akin to the Britannia's. The rebuilding eliminated the troublesome features of the original design, in particular the chain-driven valve gear, which was replaced by conventional valve-shirts gear. All 30 merchant navies and 60 light Pacifics were rebuilt in this form. Many older Southern locomotives, such as the original UDN-15s, were withdrawn in the decade, as were the various H-15s. As we've already seen, the Lord Nelsons were further downgraded, being gathered at Eastleigh for use on Bournemouth stoppers and the interregionals. However, their final duties were on ocean liner expresses to and from Southampton docks. The Drummond 440s, such as the D-15s and L-12s, the last of which is seen on a rail tour in the Solent area, were also due for replacement. The Southern strategy of electrification had been severely disrupted by the war, so these elderly engines had not been made redundant. The smaller standard classes proved to be suitable stopgaps until the programme could be resumed, which, after a 20-year gap, occurred in Kent. The Brighton Main Line and its principal secondary routes had benefited from the 30s electrification programme, so its principal steam classes had to scratch around for work, the Atlantics finding employment on the Brighton to Bournemouth trains. However, they also suffered from the flood of bullieds and standards, and here we see a sad occasion, the very last run of a British Atlantic, the Brighton's Beachy Head. The engine is seen at the end of the day outside Brighton Station in 1958. Many would have liked to see its preservation, but mainline preservation, both of locomotives and railways, didn't start until the very end of the decade. The first line was to be one of the Brighton's secondary routes, the Bluebell Railway. It was the Brighton's smallest locomotives that were to prove to be the final survivors. The Little Terriers, Class A1X, survived for use on lightly laid lines such as the Hayling Island branch, seen here. They were amongst the oldest locomotives on British railways by this time and were to become favourites amongst preservationists. Another Brighton survivor is seen at Guildford, where representatives of all the southern constituents could be seen in the early 1950s. The Maunsell Moguls were the regular motive power for the cross-country services between Redhill and Reading, which were a legacy of the South Eastern Railway. These engines had proved to be the ideal mixed-traffic secondary type for the Southern, and were to be supplemented rather than replaced by the various Class 4 standards. At this time, the Maunsell rebuilds of the D and E classes were also appearing on this line, having been rendered redundant by the various bullied light Pacifics on many of the boat train services. By the end of the decade, electrification in Kent would see them ousted from their traditional territory for good. Note the birdcage brake on this train. British Railways' replacement of pre-grouping coaching stock ran in parallel with the locomotive programme, but was mainly in the provision of diesel units, the Southern being unique in employing diesel electrics. Together with the standards, this meant the end of the road for most of the 440s from all the Southern constituents. These Class E's had all gone by 1955, and the coaches barely saw the decade out. The various push-pull trains of the Southern weren't threatened by the new equipment, used as they were on many branch lines. The Brighton D3s and Southwestern M7s, although their ranks were thinned during the 1950s, would see out the decade in their traditional roles, new push-pull stock being provided in the mid-50s by the conversion of former mainline stock. This is the Seaton branch train, made up of one of the sets consisting of Maunsell corridor stock of the 1920s. The Southern's main line to the west and its branches weren't very seriously affected by the spate of closures in the decade, most remaining unaltered from Southern days. Even though there was a degree of duplication of lines serving Exeter, British Railways allowed the status quo to remain untouched. Also seeing very little change in the 50s was the southern sprawling secondary system beyond Exeter, where the T9s found employment long after their later siblings had been reduced to scrap. The Withered Arm, as the lines west of Exeter were so graphically nicknamed, continued to serve the remoter parts of North Devon and Cornwall. The Moguls were supplemented by Broad Pacifics, which were of more use on the Dartmoor main line to Plymouth than on the one-coach trains to Padstow, which, as we noted earlier, was one of the scandals of the time. The Moguls were more than adequate for most trains, and small tank engines were sufficient in most cases. But the most notable feature of the Southern's operations in the West Country at this time was the use of ancient tank locomotives on the Bodmin and Wadebridge Railway. We saw the Beatty well tanks in the early grouping period in the first part of this series, and apart from the provision of Drummond chimneys and boilers, they have hardly changed as we see them once again 30 years later. Not only the locomotives, but working methods have hardly changed. Indeed, they've hardly changed since the last century. Herein lay one of British Railway's major problems, as the erosion of traffic by road transport meant that the economics of railway operation were undermined. Labour-intensive working practices meant that it cost nearly as much to move one wagon as a whole train. The traditional railway was labour-intensive in many ways. Signalling methods had been perfected in the 19th century, but they needed frequent signal boxes, each with 24-hour manning where the railway was continuously open. Some lines, like the Somerset and Dorset seen here, operated two-shift working for some of the time, closing down in the night hours. Even methods of speeding up the traffic flow, such as the use of the Whittaker token apparatus, which allowed trains on the single line to exchange the possession tokens at speed, were still very labour-intensive. Not only that, they also required a considerable amount of hardware, which needed frequent maintenance. The track itself was unchanged in essentials since the early days, bullhead rails having to be inspected at regular intervals in case the keys had fallen out. Signals had many working parts. Lamps needed to be lit and refueled. Locomotives and wagons needed to be oiled every day, as well as manned. Wagon brakes had to be operated by hand in most cases. All these factors were acceptable, whilst labour was cheap and willing to put up with the harsh conditions. But in the You've Never Had It So Good 1950s, the new generation was promised better conditions, and were able to find them. So the railways found it difficult to recruit new staff. This train is emerging from Coombe Down Tunnel near Bath, with an LMS 2P piloting a Black 5. This tunnel was of extremely restricted bore, and was on a severe upward gradient, so both locomotives had to work flat out. The conditions on the exposed footplate can only be imagined. Only dedicated railwaymen would accept the risk to their health. The Somerset and Dorset was home to many of the small Midland-inspired 060s and 440s, which had been adopted as standard by the LMS. Its history, however, told against it. Forever a thorn in the side of the Great Western, its joint owners had supported it well until nationalisation. However, old rivalries survived into the unified era, and its transfer to the Western region in 1958 was the beginning of the end. We now move on to true Midland metals at Market Harborough on the Midland Main Line, where a traditional Midland freight behind a 3F is followed by a Jubilee on an express. The mixed coaches are painted in the late LMS maroon and BR's first standard blood and custard liveries. By the end of the decade, the LMS maroon was to return as the standard coach livery for all but the southern region, which reverted to green. As these views were recorded in 1952, there is still evidence of the LMS. The Stanier Class 3 tank is employed on the former LNWR routes from Market Harborough to Rugby and Northampton. A Fairburn 264 tank follows with another loco. These tanks were built up until 1951 at Derby and Brighton, after which the design was adapted to form the Standard Class 4 tank. The Standard Class 3 tanks were the odd men out of the Standard range, as they weren't based on the LMS Class 3s, but the Great Western's 4100s. The IVAT Class 2s, one of which follows on a motor train, were to be the prototype for the BR version. Indeed, the LMS machines were initially used as a standard type, building continuing until 1952. The BR machines were virtually the same as these engines, but altered to use some of the standard range of fittings, themselves in many cases originally LMS items. The legend British Railways on the tank sides of these engines indicates that they are from the 1948 crew-built batch of 20, out of a total of 130 in the class. A link with the past and the earlier volumes in this series follows. A Robinson-designed Great Central 280 rattles past on a heavy mineral train. By the 1950s, most of the XROD versions of this class had been withdrawn, except those on former Great Western and LNER routes. The wagons are notable for their variety, but all are of wooden construction. We move further down the Midland Main Line towards London, where we catch a crab on a main line passenger excursion. The Midland Main Line was dominated by 460s, including the new BR Standard Class 5s, whilst the outer suburban services continued to provide employment for the various LMS 264 tanks. The Black 5s handled the semi-fasts, which could produce a fair assortment of LMS coaching stock, whilst true Midland traditions could still be observed in the form of the compounds. There was a considerable amount of freight in the London area, this jinty being involved in a transfer freight from the Cricklewood marshalling yards alongside the Midland Main Line. The need to transfer freight from one railway to another and frequent re-marshalling en route was one of the operating practices which had bedeviled British railway operations since the earliest days. The advent of the nationalised railway gave the opportunity for such practices to be simplified, and one of the key features of the 1955 modernisation plan was to be the installation of modern hump marshalling yards at strategic locations. Another of the modernisation plan's important proposals was to reduce operating costs on secondary and branch lines. Diesel multiple units were to replace the elderly steam engines and coaches on these services. This would lead not only to the elimination of machines such as this Midland 3F060, a goods engine finishing its days on branch passenger services, but to a reduction in the whole infrastructure of the railway. The diesels could run equally well in either direction. They needed no expensive preparation time, and with their power could be tailored to the train length required. It was seen as the only way to reduce costs and thus save the branches. The 3F is seen running round its train, a cost DMUs would eliminate at the junction with the main line Ashchurch. This was on the Midland's other main line, that from Birmingham to Bristol. It was a double junction as, in addition to the line through Tewkesbury, which we have just seen, it was the point where an alternative route diverged, for Birmingham via Evesham and Redditch. A 264 tank, the regular motive power on the line, awaits the passing of an express on the main line. The tank will have a far easier task than the express, which has to climb one of the most formidable obstacles on Britain's railways, the Lickey Bank. It's really quite surprising that the Midland Railway, with its predilection for small engines, had the steepest main line gradient in the country. One could say that here it could indulge in its taste for multiple locomotive workings to its heart's content. However, breaking with tradition, the Midland built the largest engine in the country, a legendary 010 nicknamed Big Bertha, seen here at the back of the 060 powered freight. It was built specifically for banking duties on the Lickey, but in 1956 it was withdrawn and replaced by a British Railways Standard Class 9F. Number 92079 was allocated to Bromsgrove Shed in that year and joined the clutch of LMS Standard Ginty shunters, which had supplemented Big Bertha. They were also to be supplemented and replaced by a number of Great Western designed Class 9400 pannier tanks by the end of the decade, an example of British Railways transferring locomotives from their native regions. To service the banking engines, at the foot of the incline there was a network of holding sidings and locomotive facilities, including a coaling stage and water cranes. The shed itself was located on the other side of the line, behind the southbound platform of Bromsgrove Station, a few hundred yards to the north of these sidings. The departure of a northbound express is seen here as a rebuilt Royal Scot prepares for its assault on the Lickey after pausing to receive assistance from two panniers. As it passes through the station, it crosses a Bristol-bound express headed by a Jubilee, number 45694, Bellerophon. One fascinating aspect of banking at Bromsgrove was the way the tail-end Charlie would race to catch up with the departing train, although in most cases the bankers would buffer up before the train set off. Whilst uphill trains used the platform road, Bristol-bound ones had a through road. There were holding sidings for trains in either direction. The 9F and its Midland 10-coupled predecessor was adequate on its own for many semi-fasts and the lighter expresses, as its power was nearly equivalent to a pair of tanks at 39,667 pounds tractive effort. The Ginties boasted 20,836 pounds, whilst the panniers amassed 22,515. Here's 67,535 pounds of banking power drifting down and then returning to work in the late 50s. Seven of the Hawksworth panniers, numbers 8400 to 8406 inclusive, were allocated to Bromsgrove from 1958 after the line was transferred from the London Midland region to the Western region, as was the Somerset and Dorset. In that year, a number of regional boundary changes were made, ostensibly to tidy up areas of responsibility, but these didn't really take into account operating practices. The transfer of the Western's own panniers was a case in point, as, although they were undoubtedly extremely effective in the task set for them, the Ginties remained. Bromsgrove Shed staff had to learn new types of machinery and had to stock a complete new set of spares. This had already happened 2 years earlier when the 9F had arrived. In addition, the drivers had to learn the characteristics of the new steeds. None of these changes can be said to have led to greater efficiency. (1958) was also to see the first use of XL and ER locomotives over the route. This was the very first run of all, with Thompson B1 number 61155 in June of that year on the return of a Derby to Bristol train. The B1s would become regular performers up the bank for the next 7 years. A Jubilee, Gibraltar, follows through the station and covers the cameraman on the footbridge with its exhaust. A pair of panniers gives assistance and are themselves followed by a quintet of native LNS locomotives ascending the bank with the greatest of ease. No train. The 9F then drifts back. 92079 was the regular engine and had a cutout on its tender top to ease hand coaling at Bromsgrove's crude coaling stage. Our final views here at the station are at the foot of the bank. Firstly, as another Black 5 makes the transition from the level track through the platforms onto the 1 in 37.7 of the bank itself. The signal indicates that the 9F coming downhill will take the platform road. 9Fs were now regular performers on trains as well as for banking. We're now alongside the bank itself, at Pike's Pool, about halfway up the 2-mile climb. Today, this view would not be possible, as the growth of lineside vegetation since the end of steam has been widespread, giving rise to the well-known phenomenon of leaves on the line, which would have been disastrous in the 1950s on the Lickey incline. The 9F drifts back past, hardly noticed by the horses under the tree, and is next seen at the back of a freight headed by another 9F, which had been checked by the intermediate home signal halfway up the bank, which allowed 2 trains to ascend the bank at any one time. The cutout in the sides of the tender coal space is well seen here, as are the scorch marks on the embankment sides, which ensured that no vegetation could get a foothold. A flying pig Ivat Class 4 mogul ascends the bank with a pristine set of blood and custard coaches in the mid-50s. Nicknames, not always complimentary, were a feature of railway stock and operations of all kinds. The post-war generation of loco-spotters, nurtured by the Ian Allen ABC books and Trains Illustrated, were well informed about railway practice and operations. The cameraman for this feature was Patrick Whitehouse, a founder member of the Talyllyn RPS with Tom Rolt. He was a prolific railway book author and first brought railways to the small screen with his colleague John Adams in the 1950s. Their regular television series of railway roundabout programs started in 1958 and captured the mood of the changing times as steam entered its last decade. This Royal Scot has a train from the Somerset and Dorset, indicated by the southern stock of Bullard design. We are now at the top of the climb at Blackwell, as a Caprotti Black 5 with double chimney, and thus one of the post-war IVAT experimental locomotives, reaches the end of its long slog to the summit. Once again, a pair of panniers provides the rear-end power. The bankers weren't coupled to the train or to each other, as they had to be detached from the train on the move after the train engine had cleared the summit, whose physical location was marked by the wooden post signals. As the bankers reached the top of the incline, they would ease off and let the train engine take the strain before the bankers entered the special holding siding between the running lines just beyond the station. There they would await a path to descend the bank, usually in convoy to save paths. As was the case for upward bankers, the descending locomotives would remain uncoupled, the front engine providing the braking power. The larger engine would usually be in that position. In addition to their duties on the Redditch Loop, the big LMS tanks were used on mainline local services, still requiring banking assistance. With the train stopping in the platform at Blackwell, the banker had to drop off early and come to a stand rather more quickly than for non-stop trains, for which the usual practice was to run through the station with the train gathering speed ahead of it. The top of the bank is well seen from the platform end as a Jubilee breasts the summit. In the background can be seen the convalescent hospital from whose footpath many of these views were recorded. It was the expense of steam age practices such as those seen here that helped tip the balance against steam in the 1950s and led to the 1955 modernization plan. However, it wasn't until the 1990s that banking over the Lickey was eliminated altogether, despite the expectations of the plan, which foresaw modern diesel or electric locomotives as being far more capable than steam. The saddest part of the modernization scheme, from the railway enthusiast's point of view, was the announcement that no more steam locomotives would be built after the current program was completed. The final steam engines were to be the 9Fs, which broke new ground at the end of the decade by being used on passenger trains. Continuing a theme developed in the earlier programs in this series, we return to the former LNWR's West Coast main line at the very beginning of our decade, to see the everyday mainline steam scene when there were only 5 mainline diesels in existence, the precursors of the modernization plan. The Black Fives were still in charge of heavily laden express goods trains, supplemented by the Crabs. LNWR locomotives were no longer part of the scene, having been ousted by the modern classes. The rebuilt Scots, Patriots and Jubilees were the mainstay of the expresses and were about to be disfigured by the addition of smoke deflectors, although the original Jubilees were to remain mercifully unadorned to the end of their days. They continued to be used on the secondary expresses, as did the original Patriots. Modernization of a railway takes a long time, although the assets aren't as permanent as this. However, it was the Victorian features that British Railways, forever short of investment funds, had to tackle as a matter of urgency. All aspects had to be addressed, from coaching stock through signalling, track work and station structures. With falling traffic, many became redundant or over-provided, and many stations with a large staff failed to cover their direct costs. In some ways, locomotive replacement was the easiest aspect of all this, and modern locomotives such as the IVAT Class 2s, with all their machinery made get-atable, required far less maintenance than their predecessors. They were cheaper to run, taken overall, than engines such as the small LNWR passenger tanks. In this respect, the LMS was the model for the early years of British Railways, having made great use of the motor trains, which would be logically developed into self-powered diesel units. We'll now move across to Beeston Castle and Tarporley Station on the Crewe to Chester and Holyhead main line, as we go around the London Midland region in the 1950s. A Black 5 precedes a rebuilt Scot, by now fitted with its smoke deflectors. Despite the emphasis in the modernization plan on diesels and electrics for future construction, it was confidently expected that the modern steam locomotives would have a normal life expectancy of around 25 to 30 years, as the changes would be introduced gradually, as had happened throughout railway history. Our next stop is Low Fell, on the northern part of the West Coast main line in the Lune Gorge. A Black 5 heads north through the station with a semi-fast train, and is followed by the West Coast's principal express, the famous Royal Scot, headed by a Duchess. Part of the modernization plan was to give the regions greater autonomy, and the introduction of maroon livery on named express trains. The principal plank of the plan was the electrification of the West Coast main line from London to Liverpool and Manchester. This exposed one of the major flaws in the unification of the railways under nationalisation, as each of the previously independent railway companies had had its own modernisation schemes for which it could raise capital. The nationalised regime could only raise capital through the government, which was only likely to look at one major scheme at a time. And there were so many different areas that needed modernising. All were interdependent, such as the elimination of the old-fashioned four-wheel wagon stock, which could go little faster than this mixed freight behind a Patriot. To achieve even these speeds meant fitting them all with continuous brakes. This would take a considerable time, and the domino effect must be felt on the first generation of diesels, which had to have more braking power than would be necessary later on. This was to compensate for the lack of brakes on the older wagons. The modernization time span was enormous. For example, electrification of the whole of the West Coast main line through to Scotland wouldn't be completed until the 1970s, 20 years after the modernization plan was announced. In the meantime, urgent action was required. Steam could be inefficient in many ways, including the use of large engines on marginal work and much non-revenue earning turns. But the infrastructure was in place for the railways to work with steam. The first phases of the plan would have to be integrated into the existing infrastructure. As we've already noted, each of the original railways had had their own plans, which had been overtaken by events. The division of British Railways into regions was soon to result in the transfer of formerly competing lines into one region. In Cumbria, dominated by ex-LMS lines, the old LNER branch to Silloth was put into the London Midland region, although LNER locomotives continued to provide the motive power. However, this was to be one of the earliest areas for the introduction of self-contained diesel railcars, later known as diesel multiple units. This took place in 1954, a year before the modernization plan, and it was one of the first signs that British Railways would eventually create an integrated railway. The rich variety of steam at places such as Carlisle, probably once the most varied of all, would go forever under the plan. It was a very rare railway enthusiast who didn't shed a tear for the steam engine when the end of the line was so starkly announced. But in the 50s there was still life in the old dog yet. On the eastern and northeastern regions, as the LNER had become, the magnificent Gresley Pacifics were all to receive double chimneys, proven to be a major advance by the exploits of Mallard before the war. The beginning of the decade saw the final withdrawal of the legendary Ivat Atlantics and the first post-war running of preserved locomotives on a special train. An example of each of the small and large boilered Atlantics had been preserved at the York Railway Museum. They were returned to working order to head 2 privately sponsored rail tours in September 1953 to celebrate the centenary of Doncaster Works, familiarly known as the Plant. The trains were the Plant Centenarian, and they ran on the 20th and 27th of September. The engines remain at York today. Not so lucky were the 2 former Wisbech and Upwell tramway coaches seen behind a Great Eastern J69 tank. They were later to be restored for preservation, but then were broken up all the same, except for the body of the 6-wheeled brake third. It had featured in the Titfield Thunderbolt film. The railway is the Kelvedon and Torsbury Light Railway, which was located in the heart of Great Eastern Country on the Essex coast between Southend and Clacton. It closed to passengers in May 1951. Another Great Eastern tank is seen far from home on the Scottish borders. It was one of 2 sent to Galashiels Shed in 1944 to work the short but steeply graded Lauder Light Railway, which left the famous Waverley route at Fountainhall Junction. The branch was built in the last years of the last century by the North British Railway, opening on the 2nd of July 1901. As it was a light railway, the Permanent Way Department imposed severe restrictions on the types of locomotives able to work on it. So, when the J67s were allocated here, they were coupled to ex-North British tenders, using their water tanks instead of their own side tanks. The latter remained empty. The branch had lost its passenger services as long ago as 1929, and was to close in its entirety on the 1st of October 1958. The J67s both went in 1956. Back at Fountainhall, Gresley A3 Servisto on an express precedes a Thompson B1 on a local. The railways of the border counties served very sparsely populated districts, and many closed in the 1950s, including the southern part of the inland route from Alnwick to Tweedmouth via Coldstream, which had lost its passenger service as long ago as 1930. The rest of the line, seen here, would survive the 50s. Each of the regions had its own colour. The northeastern's was orange. Colour also flowered with the painting of station pilots in pre-grouping liveries, such as this J72 at York, where we see Merlin pass through on the non-stop. This A4 had acquired its double chimney by this time, whilst Wilson Worsdale, an A1 named after the famous northeastern locomotive designer, has a neater chimney than when she, or he, was built. The last A1s were built in the early 50s. Gresley's and Thompson's interpretations of mixed traffic locomotives pass outside Yorkshed and are followed by another double chimney A4 approaching from the north. The passenger V2 heads maroon coaches, and the northeastern tank shunts some more. Another one was similarly treated for Newcastle, and some J69 tanks were painted Great Eastern blue for Liverpool Street. The A4's domination of East Coast expresses lasted to the end of the decade. Remarkably, this J72 was actually built in the 50s, 3 years after Velocity, one of Peppercorn's A2s. 28 of the little tanks were built between 1949 and 1951, to a Victorian design. Another K3 is seen on the main line. These were the first large-boilered Gresley engines, effectively the forerunners of the legendary A3s, on which development continued in the 50s. They were fitted with double chimneys and Kilchap exhausts, even though they were a 30-year-old design. This was part of the general policy for the East Coast, which had to take second place to the West Coast in British Railways plans. Under the modernisation plan of 1955, the West Coast had been chosen as the showpiece for electrification, with the East Coast expected to follow shortly thereafter. As we've already noted, at that time steam was expected to have a rather longer-term future than was actually the case, and East Coast steam might reasonably be expected to carry on until electrification could take place. However, the rapid deterioration in railway finances caused the speeding up of the elimination of steam, and political infighting slowed the West Coast plan. So the Eastern authorities had to prepare an interim dieselization policy. The result of all this was that the former LNER main lines were still the fastest and most modern steam routes in the 1950s, with its wide range of modern classes such as the V2s and V1s. The British Railways standard classes had less impact here than on the other regions, although the first Britannias were drafted to the Great Eastern section at the beginning of the decade, and the moguls of classes 3 and 4 supplemented the B1s and K1s on mixed traffic duties. Their impact was perhaps greater on the Scottish region, carved as it was from the Scottish lines of both the LNER and LMS. Again, the standards were used more on the ex-LMS lines, the LNER ones still sporting venerable machines such as this Great North of Scotland D40. The last survivor, Gordon Highlander, would be preserved in 1959. Blue was the appropriate colour for the Scottish region. Having a vast area and relatively small population, it had many secondary or branch lines, vulnerable in the changing world of the 1950s. Many were to lose their passenger services, as did the Alford branch, the Great North of Scotland branch from Kintore on the Aberdeen to Inverness main line, seen here being worked by a North British Class J 36. Passenger services were withdrawn from the 2nd of February 1950, so the line probably carried no passengers in the 1950s except on enthusiast specials. Like many others, it remained in use for freight throughout the 50s, but was to feel the full impact of the winds of change and Dr. Richard Beeching. But that's another story.